To explore the cold case revelations and investigative insight of a good cop turned UFO gumshoe, this is Neon Galactic. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. One of the most iconic and baffling UFO close encounter cases in the past 80 years at Rendlesham Forest in December of 1980 has long been a source of wonder and intrigue for even the most serious UAP researchers. It's a case that demonstrates all the attributes that make this field so enthralling for so many. Close-up encounters with an unknown technology, audio recordings from the field at the time, clandestine government interference and enforced secrecy, multiple witnesses, biological consequences, laughably absurd attempts at debunking, and perhaps most importantly, interference by these strange airbound interlopers with the most destructive technology in humanity's arsenal, nuclear weapons. For decades, the public has been jerked around, tantalized by the testimony of witnesses, yet forever straight-armed away from solid conclusions by governments invested in manufacturing complacency and debunkers working to make it all seem ridiculous. Our guest today, Gary Heseltine, is working to break this logjam. A career detective whose work has been pivotal on cases that range from rape and murder to terrorism in the City of London, Heseltine has retired from law enforcement to investigate the truth about UFOs, UAPs, and what they represent for our species. His most recent book, Non-Human: The Rendlesham Forest Incident, 42 Years of Denial, makes new progress in this legendary case and reminds us that the UFO phenomenon didn't start with the Tic Tac encounter of 2004 with Lou Elizondo or even with David Grush. These mysteries have been with us for decades, perhaps millennia, and there remains much to be learned in taking a closer look at many of these older encounters. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I am thrilled actually to talk with you. I've interviewed a lot of folks about this subject and investigations into this subject, and how do we kind of get a closer glimpse of the truth. But rarely have I talked to someone who's an actual trained professional investigator who I think can parse facts from bullshit. So I appreciate you coming on the show and talking with us about this. First off, I want to kind of give people a sense of your background and what your worldview about this kind of thing. What makes a good cop, and how do those skills translate into investigating something like the UFO phenomenon?
There are a few police officers who've become involved in the UAP subject over the years, whether it be in the UK or the US predominantly. But most people get involved in the subject because they've had some kind of an experience. And I'm no different. I had a childhood sighting when I was 16, but that didn't manifest itself until I was, in my late 30s when I really became an active researcher. I'd followed the subject on and off for many, many years, was well aware of the best evidence from around the world. By that stage, I was a serving police detective. I ended up doing 19 years as a detective. I didn't want high rank. My specialism, for want of a better word, was interviewing people. So I became an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses, which was designed for murder, manslaughter, rape. And so in the end, I had 6 years in the Royal Air Force as a police officer. Prior to joining the police, I had then a 24-year career in the police, the last 19 years as a detective. And together, that's about 30 years of policing experience. So in that time, I can only ever look at the UFO subject through what I would call evidentialized. What I mean by that is I'm so used to putting cases to court, then in theory, what would stand up in a court of law. And that's a phrase I've often used. There is real evidence when you look at the best cases, best UFO cases from around the world and historical. There are literally hundreds of radar confirmed cases going back to the 40s, 50s. There are cosmonauts, air traffic controllers, military pilots, commercial pilots. Police officers are just one of those categories. Are police officers, can they make mistakes? Of course they can. But the vast majority will only ever raise get involved in this if they've had something personal or they've been with others when it's happened and they feel more comfortable as a group to say, yeah, I saw this. Don't know what it was. I really became known within the field in 2002 when I launched an unofficial national police database in the UK called Prufos, Police Reporting UFOs. And it was designed for UK police officers to report incidents. Now, it wasn't just officers coming to me. A lot of it was historical research because I went back through loads of newspaper archives and I found that many officers had gone on the record throughout the UK. And I look at it now, and I started off with something like 6 cases involving a dozen police officers, British police officers. I now have over 550 cases involving over 1,100 British police officers. So you can see that it's a tip of an iceberg. And I have no doubt that in the US, with its size, of course, and the increased population over the UK, that there've been literally thousands of US police officers who've had experiences if the same process was repeated, that there was somebody there just collecting police officer reports. I don't think there is. There's been sporadic small groups collecting some reports, but I don't think there's like a national database on police officers. And it's a shame because the Prufos model could be replicated anyway. It would be better if you're a serving police officer when you do this, or a retired police officer, because then you've got credibility with the people you're talking to. But in terms of the wider thing about, good cop, bad cop, there are good cops. The vast majority are good, honest people. There are some bad cops, but I would say that's the same in every field. The vast majority of people are good, but you'll always find a few bad apples, as they say in the UK. But in terms of detective training, few people in the UFO field, the research field, have had any kind of investigative training other than that they pick up from UFO groups like MUFON groups who do courses and things like that, which are very useful, but it's not quite the same as being an active detective working on murders and whatever. So the critical thing is, from my point of view, is I look at it through the 3 forms of evidence that we take to court all around the Western world, which is witness testimony, that then becomes written testimony. When you see something, you've observed something, you don't just repeat it, blah, blah, blah. It then gets written down into a statement form, and it's written in a way for a court procedure, the way it's laid out. Yeah. So that's when things become written. So anything written is got what's called documentary evidence. So if you think of a fraud case, the bank transaction on such and such a day, you withdrew X amount of money, that can be printed off. That's a piece of paper you can say, this is exhibit GH1, and it would stand up in a court of law. It's something, it's a fact. Yeah. Testimony, which in the UFO field is so derided. Oh, anybody can make a mistake. Yeah, anybody can make a mistake. But if 10 people make the same mistake, it's not a mistake. They've witnessed something. And that's the difference, is that the normal rules of investigation go out the window when it comes to UFO, UAP activity because of the stigma attached to the subject. And people just want to debunk it. And we know why they want to debunk it, because it goes right back to the Robertson panel, 1953, CIA inspired, get 12 scientists together for 2 days, find me a way to strip the fascination that the public have for this subject. And after 2 days, what do they come up with? You work with all forms of the media to debunk, ridicule. And that came in 53. So anybody born after 1953 has lived in a deliberate disinformation world. And most people don't realize that. But it worked fantastically well because it was backed by the mainstream media, which then you could easily control. Not so easy now with social media. But that's where the stigma comes from, and it's worked incredibly well. But yeah, the normal rules of evidence about testimony, documentary evidence, i.e. documents that support it. And the other thing is, as well, is the third part that works on all cases presented in an American court or a British court is physical evidence, which in the UK we call real evidence. But in simple terms, it's physical evidence. So what that means is this pair of glasses that I'm holding up is something that's tangible. You can touch it. It could be the stolen motor car, the motorcycle. It could be the gun, the knife, the rope to kill somebody. You can hold it up and say, look, this is exhibit GH1, a pair of glasses that he used to gouge the eye out of the TV presenter that he was doing an interview with. You see what I mean? It's something physical.
Yeah.
And there are so many cases that would put that together. It's called the circumstantial evidence case. And when people say circumstantial, they make it sound as if it's weak. But I remember a judge at a Crown Court, the highest court in the UK, at a case I was involved in, saying circumstantial evidence is actually one of the strongest cases because it's reliant on great testimony, on documents that support that great testimony, and then it's backed up by physical evidence that supports the documents and the testimony. So, you know, a lot of people just, it's a misnomer. People just think circumstantial art means they guess it. No, far from it. So we have those rules of evidence that we could apply easily to the Tic Tac case, to Rendlesham Forest and things like that, because there's testimony from multiple military witnesses in both Tic Tac and Rendlesham. There's documentary evidence. There's the Holt Memorandum, a famous document from 1980 that was written about that said that there were two events set 24 hours apart or 48 hours apart. Tic Tac, you've got that report that was done into it, the classified report. You have radar tapes that were taken away to wherever. You have the multiple, the likes of Kevin Day doing the radar. You have the likes of Commander David Fravor getting involved, Chad Underwood and people like that. And so when you put it all together, we have some fantastic court cases that if you were to put into a hypothetical case with a jury and present the very, very best evidence of UFOs from around the world, it would be hands down that the jury would say we're dealing with something that's real, tangible, and let's do something about it. But we don't do it.
Yeah. And I think as part of it's that self-reinforcing, like you were saying, misinformation campaign. The Robertson panel has become part of the culture, and they don't even have to propel it anymore because it constantly propels itself, which is frustrating.
Absolutely. But it's good that people are now talking about those kind of incidents that people didn't realize where the stigma came from. You know, but the social media is changing things. And, you know, we're going off point here, but I'm sure at some point we would talk about it. I actually think in terms of the disclosure process, we may be at the point, if disclosure doesn't come this year in through presidential or whatever, through the US or another country coming forward, I think we are close to a catastrophic disclosure event, which is the worst case scenario, because the vast majority of people, 95% of people, don't have a clue about the best evidence of UFOs, simply because it's never presented them in a structured manner, unless you go looking for this subject, of which there's loads of TV shows and whatever. Unless you know what the best evidence is and where to look, you know, you go online and you have a million armchair experts. They're not real researchers, podcasters, and no disrespect to you, but they're a new phenomenon. But in some ways, they're the new investigators. They're not investigators, they're researchers. But what they do is garner an audience which was never there before. So I don't have a problem with podcasters, and I do any podcast that anybody wants me to do, because just by talking about it, you are indirectly raising the awareness. And in social media, it's so important that we challenge the existing mainstream narrative, because the mainstream narrative has been controlled right since the Robertson panel and before, but particularly since 1953. And so the rise of social media, if you think of the likes of Tucker Carlson getting 20, 30 million to interview Putin and things like that, that's not a TV channel. It's now social media, but it shows you the power of an audience now and how big and a bigger part social media can play if it's played in the right way. And it breaks away from that mainstream dominance. The problem we still got, and it's very active in the US and it's very active in the UK, is that if the mainstream corporate elite don't want to talk about it, it's very difficult to get more than 2 or 3 minutes here and there to discuss it. If it was any other subject, like Epstein, it'd be wall to wall coverage because, there's a real story here. Now, there is a real story with UFOs. Trouble is, the mainstream media are warned off it, or they're told, no, don't go near it. We don't do UFOs. And I'm sure that's the same in the US. And it's a real shame. So I think the likes of social media are really important because we have to challenge that. But going back to what I said about catastrophic disclosure might be the only way we'll get it.
Yeah.
If you think, I've been saying for many years now, that if we had an event like the Phoenix Lights occur tonight, replicated entirely, tracked for a couple of 100 miles approaching Phoenix, city of Phoenix, seen by 50,000 plus people, seen a huge boomerang-shaped object estimated to be a mile wide, stop over the city. What would happen? People would go out on that journey now. They'd be straight on the 4K, 8K smartphones. Then they'd be going, right, okay, let's live stream this. Live streaming. Then you can't control the media. And then somebody's going, there's a major event going on over Phoenix. Live stream, live stream, live stream. So we not just get one or two sources, we get literally thousands of live stream sources. That's when the cat becomes out of the bag because some of the cameras will collect data of this huge object in clarity that we've never seen before. And then the cat's out of the bag. And don't forget, 95% of the people still think we're all crazy. But then you're into this leap from yesterday it was Tuesday, now it's Wednesday, but now the world has changed forever.
Totally a different place, yeah.
A totally different place. And that's the danger of catastrophic disclosure, which is what Cal Nell talked about, at the Sol Foundation. That's the least worst case scenario. So I'm hoping that maybe this year, later on down the line, although I'm not optimistic at the moment, the way things are going with the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia, etc., that seem to be getting in the way. But what a lot of people don't realize is that once this comes out, the world is never the same, and it kind of transcends and affects everything else.
Hopefully changes the channel.
We're in a very strange place at the moment, but I do think disclosure of a type is coming. It has to. We're reaching a tipping point.
I wanted to give people a baseline. Could you, relatively briefly, what was the Rendlesham Forest Incident? Obviously, you've written this book, and I'm interested to find out what you think are some of the nuggets that you pulled out of this cold case with your new investigation. But there's a lot that happened, a lot of detail. So, as much as you can, summarize for us what that event was and then what your mission was in the creation of this book.
Okay. Indirectly, I would say, or publicly, I've said it many times now, I think the Rendlesham Forest case is arguably the most complicated case in UFO history. And that's because there are multiple agendas at play. There are multiple personal agendas at play. There are government agendas, media agendas at play. And a lot of it was to downplay the significance of what happened. I'd become well aware of the case from the early 80s when it became hit the news headlines in October 1983. So just as a quick summary, pre-2017, when I began research for my book, the story was that in late December, over 2, possibly 3 nights, multiple UFOs had been seen in and around what was called Rendlesham Forest, which lay between 2 twin bases, US bases, leased from the Royal Air Force, called RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, about 80 miles northeast of London. And basically, when the case broke publicly in terms of worldwide media coverage, it was a big newspaper headline in October 1983. So basically about almost 3 years after the events. And the headline was UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official. And they said that's official because they'd managed to get hold of a one-page, what's called the Holt Memorandum, written by the former Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who was the Deputy Base Commander of what was a nuclear strike base. Basically, it was a strike base in the event of Soviet aggression. It's still the Cold War, don't forget. This is 1980. And basically, this memo confirmed that there'd been at least 2 incidents, UAP related. It never said UFOs. It never said UAP, it said unexplained lights, and that was done deliberately to try to play it down. But the actual 3 paragraphs were amazing because they alluded to one, a landed object on what was the first night, and then basically 2 nights later, Holt himself, the deputy base commander, goes out into the forest and sees multiple UFOs, and others with him see multiple UFOs. And because that was on US Air Force note, headed paper, it's a real document. It was not fiction. So that's basically what we knew, that there'd been some UFO incidents, at least 2 nights of activity prior to 2017. In 2017, I was asked to get involved in a proposed documentary called Capel Green, which actually premieres in 2 days' time at a cinema in the UK. 8 years down the line, I was only involved for the first 3 years, but I was asked to be the lead researcher. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to put my name to it, I'm going to do a deep dive and just make sure. I thought I knew the case pretty well, and by most people's standards, I did. But having agreed to be the lead researcher, I thought, no, let's do a deep dive from everything post the incident. So basically, everything since the end of December 1980. And cutting a long story short, I re-interviewed many of the military witnesses. I found new military witnesses who'd never gone on the record. Because I was an advanced interviewer, I was able to use some of those techniques to say, let's make them comfortable enough that they wanted to really concentrate and see if they could remember things. And they did on 2 or 3 occasions. There's some really key interviews that came out. And cutting a long story short, in the conclusions of the book, we're not talking about 2 days or 3 days. I now believe that the incidents take place over perhaps a week, because I came across a report made by a credible military witness, an airman called Steve Wagner, who'd never spoken about it, that there was an incident on the 23rd of December. Okay, so this is a couple of nights before. Everybody who's seen the documentaries involving Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, the first night landing where there was a small triangular craft, approximately 3 meters by 3 meters in size, 2 meters its highest point. It was black like glass. It was warm to the touch, according to Jim Penniston, who walked around it, photographed it. Photographs later came out fogged. Why, we don't know. Whether he was told a lie, whether he was just, given a disinformation story, we don't know. But he said he took photographs. He said he walked around it. He drew pictures of it in his pocketbook. He touched it. He said that he felt like raised etchings, saw various figures, like writing on the side of it, symbols. Whilst John Burroughs, who was with him, he never described it that way. He was some 20, 30 meters away from him, stood back, watching Penniston, who was right next to this craft. And basically, John Burroughs would say, I saw a bank of lights that suggested structure behind it, because the brightness of the lights he couldn't actually see from his vantage point, which is fine, because that's his vantage point. So he's going to have a different perception of what was going on. Then basically 2 nights later, Holt is told there's a UFO seen in the forest again. So he assembles a small team, goes back out there, and whilst they're out in the forest, they see multiple UFOs. One UFO initially that appeared to be like maybe the size of a car maneuvering through the trees, and it sounds kind of ridiculous when you say it like that, but what you have to understand is that in December 1980, the forest had what was called Corsican pines, and the Corsican pine branches were bare until about 15 to 20 feet off the ground, and they were laid out like sticks in rows when they were planted. So anything
kind of thing,
so anything that was seen under the canopy could easily be seen maneuvering. So even a smaller object, but it was described as being like red, glowing, like with a dark center, like an eye winking at you, and there appeared to be molten metal dripping off it.
Yeah.
although no material was ever recovered. But that was then tracked until it was seen in an open farmer's field, and it was seen near a farmhouse where it was so bright that it reflected into the windows, made it look like the house was on fire. It was seen through early night vision goggles or a scope, and confirmed by multiple witnesses. So that's basically what we knew 2017. Post 2017, I ended up with 17 different timed UFO events over approximately a week-long period. Now, that's nothing like you've been shown in all the documentaries, of which there's been 50 or 60. You basically all have seen John and Jim about the first night, and Holt and his maybe one or two of his group talking about when they went into the forest 2 days later. Nobody's talking about 17 different timed events. And what I did is I approached the reinvestigation like a cold case review, a police cold case review. And so I'd already met a lot of the people by the time I did this, but I took sentiment out of it and just said, well, I'm just going to look at the facts, which sounds corny, but that's what I did. I would just concentrate on the facts and present the evidence how it fell. But what I did do though was say, well, if there's an interview from 1984, I'm going to review it. I'll put it in the book so people will read it. But I'm going to draw out key points as an experienced detective and say, this is interesting because, this is interesting because, and make some general assertions that you can do. You can make reasoned deductions from analysing the data, the written data. So that's what I did, and that was my mantra. The evidence falls where it falls, and if you take the sentiment out of it, then you can't be accused of bias. And so that's what I tried to do. It took me 3 years to write it, 5 years to research, and it was published in February 2023. Now, the thing is, I upset some people, and I knew I'd upset some people because of the existing narrative, in my opinion, has been controlled probably by 4 people for the last 25 years. And those are Nick Pope through his media links, the ex-MOD guy, Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, and Charles Holt. Because I've worked on many TV documentaries, both US documentaries and UK documentaries, and when they get a premise to do a show, their premise is basically, right, this is what we're going to research, a little documentary, it'll probably be an hour's long. These are the things that we're going to cover. How do we go about doing this? And so they get their researchers. And who do they go to? They know nothing about the subject. So who do they go to? Oh, well, let's go to the Rendlesham witnesses. Oh, let's go to Nick Pope and say, right, who do you want in this documentary? Well, I think we'll have him. I think we'll have him. And that's how you have a narrative that's controlled. And the narrative that you are being given is not the full one, because they're not talking about the witnesses that I've interviewed. They're not trying to delve deeper and establish new facts. They want to keep this narrative of basically just 2 nights. Whereas in my book, I end up finding this incident on the 23rd. I end up finding entirely new events because I've re-interviewed people, and in one case, interviewed somebody for the first time properly, a sergeant called Adrian Bustinza, who comes up with not only a corroboration of a second landing, a much more important landing where senior officials were there, and that it was being filmed on video and early cinefilm and early video, which was around in December 1980. The US did have those kind of cameras, checked all that. There is such a wealth to it. But cutting a long story short, 17 different incidents, and yet the 55, 60 English-made documentaries or English-spoken documentaries don't feature any of this material. And that's because the narrative is controlled. And I think that's what we need to get out. And people like yourself, by allowing me to try to give you this information and saying, well, read it for yourself. These are the facts. These are what I found. But I also did an historical deep dive, and I found old interviews that had been done with some of the military witnesses going back to the early 80s that basically nobody had ever heard of. They were in obscure little UFO group publications. But the earliest times of interviews are really pertinent because they're closest to the time of the incident.
Yeah.
And if you think about it now, we're 45 years down the line in December.
Mm-hmm.
People aren't going to be around forever. Colonel Williams, Gordon Williams, who was the base commander in charge of the twin bases, responsible for 12,000 military personnel, I think he died in 2018. So there's lots of questions of him that I would have loved to ask, but you would never get near him because he didn't want to talk about it. People like James Fox interviewed him for several of his documentaries, and he played kid gloves around it. But he knew a lot more. And just a case in point is Grant Cameron, a friend of mine, very good researcher, obviously Canadian, very well respected for his work on presidential UFOs. Well, I'd met Grant several times over the years, and I'd also invited him over to the UK to one of the conferences. I run an online PDF magazine called UFO Truth Magazine, and that's what I did when I retired from the police in 2013. I launched this online magazine, and that was because my passion by then was I've got to do something. I felt compelled to do it. But in the course of that, I'd met Grant and many other leading researchers. And he told me about, it was actually recorded in my home. We did a little clip. Kit Green was a famous scientist, CIA. And you may have heard Gary Nolan, Dr. Gary Nolan, talk about that he'd been working with people who had allegedly got close proximity injuries through being close to UFOs. Well, on this list of people, the majority of which I believe were military personnel from around the world, probably mostly US and some UK probably. But in terms of Rendlesham, Grant Cameron said to me, "Oh yeah." And Kit Green told me that there was some Rendlesham witnesses. I said, "Who were the Rendlesham witnesses?" And I was interested to know the names. And he went, "Well, there's John Burroughs is the most famous one because at the citizens' hearings in 2013, the mock congressional hearing that ran for a week, of which I was one of the researchers who gave testimony there, he was asked." John Burroughs was asked about his records, and he said they're all sealed away. I can't get this. I've had serious health problems. Blah blah blah. Can
Filed
you help?
suit even, right?
Yeah, and they basically eventually got his records, or to the point where he was awarded VA assistance, and he was able to have an operation that saved his life.
And
So
Senator
Grant
John
Cameron,
McCain intervened at one
yeah,
point.
that's right. So we're talking very serious people, and basically, the other person with him from the same incident was Jim Pennison. So he said Jim Pennison. I said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I said, who's the third? And he'd already told me it was, but I'd set it up on the camera to like come out as a surprise. I said, who's the third? And he said, Gordon Williams, the base commander. And I went, oh, the base commander. He says he was never there. So how do you get close proximity injuries when you're not there? However, my book revealed that two people put him there. And the first one was the original military whistleblower, which was a guy called Larry Warren, really vilified witness, ridiculed by the likes of Holt, Pennison, Burroughs, Nick Pope, all ridiculed him. And yet his account had been out since late 1982 and went public by late 1983 under his own name, saying, my name is Larry Warren. And he ran with the story using his name for about 8 years until Holt retired in 1991, until Pennison retired, until John Burroughs retired, at which point they all retire and attack him. Say, no, that doesn't gel with our memories, blah, blah, blah. And that's where the conspiracy, in a sense, began against him. But during the course of the research of the book, I spoke to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who I believe is arguably the most important linking witness. And I mean linking because he links to multiple events. Yeah, he's a key player in some of the events. And he was somebody that had been traumatized, suffered post-trauma, PTSD. He'd had some health injuries himself because he was in close proximity to UAP. Not that anybody would know about it because nobody interviewed him. It took me 2 years to eventually get an agreement to speak to him. And then I did a 4.5 hour transatlantic telephone call where I tried to use my advanced training to set him up in the right way, and he got really into it, and he really kind of bared his soul for the first time. And he basically confirmed that 90% of what Larry Warren had said was true. And what Warren had said all those years back was that there'd been a second landing. He didn't know there was a second landing because it was the only event he was involved in. They assumed it was his. But he said that he was one of approximately 10 to 15 US security police officers who were put around a cordon of what was a green, strange green mist, a circular pattern of ground-hugging mist, which is weird in itself. It appeared to a distinct shape. 1 to 2 feet off the ground, and it kind of glowed, and they're in a cordon around it. And then he hears somebody over the radio saying, "It's coming." And then he sees a red light come from the direction of the North Sea, which was approximately only a mile away, mile and a half away from their location. And he said it came in, it says it's the size of a basketball, and it goes directly towards the mist, stops over the mist, and then there's a huge explosion of light. And when their eyes adjust, there is a craft, a structured, shimmering craft where the mist had been. So it's something has transformed. And then it gets really strange because he then said senior military officers turned up, a group of them, including Colonel Gordon Williams, that base commander who allegedly was never there, but has close proximity injuries, brain injuries. And basically they turn up, and he says, even more bizarre, he says that 3 entities emerged from what was he described as like a bubble slipping off this craft. Didn't come through a doorway or through a window. He said something just slipped off it like a bubble, and then the bubble divided into 3 bubbles, and in the middle of the 3 bubbles was the upper torso of what we would call a grey, like a snowy figure, but wearing some kind of a garment. And they then were next to the craft, just floating there. Sounds like science fiction, but it was later corroborated by this Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, and that was the key thing. And basically, there's some kind of silent face-off between Colonel Gordon Williams, the base commander of 12,000 people, and these entities from about 6 feet apart, 10 feet apart. Nothing could be heard. So whether it was telepathic, but there appeared to be some kind of face-off. Where Adrian Bustinza comes in, Warren also said that it was being filmed on 2 cameras. Early video, which was big shoulder thing then, and on a tripod, cine camera, which made more sense for 1980. He also said something that was interesting, was that at the edge of this farmer's field where this second landing took place, there were a couple of British police officers, in black uniform, which has always been denied, even by the British police, being denied. But he said that, so that was that story. And then all these years later, when I finally got hold of Bustinza, he'd already told me a load of other stuff, but he then says that Larry Warren was actually closer to the craft than he was. He was a part of that cordon as well. So if he's one of the 10 or 15 that surrounded it, now he doesn't talk about the mist, but what he talks about is the structured craft and its memory. So you can't upload him and say, well, what about the mist? That would then be him. So this is, it's what he said, but it's enough, right? Because what he said was there is a cordon. Larry Warren is actually closer to this craft than he is. He said senior officers turn up, including Colonel Williams, the base commander. There is this kind of face-off with, he didn't like to use the word alien entities or whatever. He described them as silhouettes. And the reason why he called them silhouettes is, from his perspective, is he was very religious. This freaked him out. He did not like talking about it. And there'll be lots of other people who probably would respond in the same way. But he said there was motion cameras there, as in video camera. He only recalls one, but it was a video camera. It's not still camera. He also recalled the British police being there. So there's enough details there to say, well, that's 90% of what Warren had said. And so this finally put to bed this alleged second landing that Holt had always trashed. No, I wasn't there. Bustinza said Holt was there. Larry Warren said Holt was there. Bustinza said he was ordered by Holt to collect the still cameras and taken by the British police at the edge of the field and put them into plastic bags and give them to Colonel Holt. That's how specific Bustinza is about what Holt had said to him. Holt denies all of this. So you can see that the existing narrative is not quite the way you've been told. Yeah. And the more perspectives you can get, the better the narrative, the real narrative will be. But he basically corroborated this long-held, disputed evidence of a second landing, which was more significant because it involved entities and it also involved a craft that was bigger than the first night landing. It was estimated at 20, 30 feet across, kind of like diamond shape. Basically, the base commander was there and it'd been filmed. So if you can imagine that incident alone, if real, which I believe it is, that could have changed disclosure if that film had come out 40 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So when you've got a case as involving as that, and there were other multiple incidents, you can see why the Americans would want to play it down, that the base commander had been talking to some kind of being, wherever it is. Non-human intelligence is what we call it today. Now, that would be absolutely dynamite. So what happens? They go to the media, denotice, kill it, no coverage, play it down. Anything you hear, you'd ridicule. And within days, the BBC are ridiculing it. This is not just guesswork. This is a deliberate ploy to downplay the significance of what had occurred. And they managed to keep a lid on it. But bit by bit, things have come out. You know, there was one of the key things that came out that we weren't aware of is for a long time there were only 2 nights of activity because there were 2 nights in the memorandum, and that's the only document we had. But over the years, prior to 2017, there'd been rumours that a lady, a female officer, or Bonnie Tamplin, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, something had happened to her whilst she was on patrol where she was so traumatized that basically she never went on shift again. But we didn't know what. Well, in the course of my research for the film and the book, we found out pretty much nailed on what happened. And this is we owe this down to a guy called Airman Michael Stacey Smith, who features in the book and in the film. And he's making his first ever interviews. And basically what he'd had an incident earlier in the year, in July of 1980, another UFO incident, which nobody talks about.
Same place?
In the same vicinity of the twin bases. This was actually on the bases at RAF Woodbridge. What happened to him in July? Let me just put this in context. In the book, I highlight 3 what I call precursor cases. So these are pre this late cluster in late December 1980, because they're significant, because one occurs in February of 1980, another one in July 1980, another one in November 1980. Now, surely, if we're talking about UFOs and nuclear activity and why UFOs are drawn there, this is surely all part of the same kind of interest in, it's not a one-off event. But the media never talk about these cases. So this was important that we told these stories and got this testimony. And he'd already told me about what happened to him in July. And then I said, is there any other incident that's occurred that you thought was odd or whatever? And he said, well, there was another one. And I said, what was it? He said, it was to do with Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. And I said, what, the female officer who we don't really know much about? He said, yeah. He said, and this there used to be what was called 2 nights, and then it became 3 nights of official activity. And in the middle was this Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. We knew something had happened to her because she'd been heard over the radio, and several people, military witnesses, had gone on the record to say they'd heard her screaming over the radio. But we didn't know what had heard. All we know is that she was screaming over the radio, and obviously your senses, your hearing, you become a witness. You've heard her screaming, so you can testify that you heard someone screaming. You don't know the context, but you can say at such and such time I heard over the radio what I believe to be Lieutenant Body Tamplin screaming, "Help, help, help, Bobby, Bobby." And she was referring to Sergeant Robert Ball. Now, going back to Michael Stacey Smith, this is where we get an insight into what really happened to her. He said, I was at RAF Bentwaters, which is approximately a mile and a half, 2 miles away from RAF Woodbridge. So if you think of Woodbridge there, a forest in the middle, Rendlesham Forest, and then basically you've got the second base, RAF Bentwaters. Bentwaters was the more important base because it contained strategic nuclear weapons held in what was called a weapons storage area. And I know this because when I was in the Royal Air Force Police, I worked on 2 nuclear bases doing exactly the same job as what the US Air Force Security Police were doing, i.e. small yield tactical weapons to deploy to aircraft in the event of a nuclear exchange with Russia, the Soviet aggression. So that's what it was. And so basically Bentwaters, and they had a big police HQ there. And he said, I was told to quickly go down to what was called the Butley Gate. The Butley Gate was the rear back entrance to RAF Bentwaters. You obviously have a main entrance and you've got people there checking your passes and whatever. This was a back gate onto a rural country road and rarely used, but it was there in case of emergency access. Get down to the Butley Gate, open it up. He's not told why. He rushes down there, opens up the gate. 5 minutes later, a convoy of 3, 4, 5 military police vehicles, US Air Force Security Police vehicles, all go rush out at speed through the back gate. And he's thinking, what the hell's going on? He doesn't know. There are multiple radio channels, so he's not able to listen to everything. He's only can hear some of what's going on, right? And literally nothing happens for 10 minutes, and then he sees a vehicle coming back in through the gate, and it's being driven by Sergeant Robert Ball. I mentioned his name earlier. We know that over the radio she'd shouted, "Help, help, help, Bobby, Bobby," heard by other officers, but we didn't know why. Now, this time, she's seen as the front passenger seat looking disheveled. She's shook up. She's not wearing a beret. She's crying hysterically. She's shaking like a leaf. So something's really traumatized her. We still don't know what it was. But she's driven in by Bobby, Sergeant Robert Ball, who's never really gone on the record. And if you're out there, Robert, if you're still alive, I'd love you to come forward and I'd love to interview you properly for the record. I want to get your testimony if you're out there. Thank you. And basically, in that vehicle goes, he's thinking, she looks really upset. Wonder what's happened to her. Of course you would. And he knew her because she'd been friendly with him as one of his commanding officers. 10 minutes after that, a vehicle returns that's got significant roof damage, as if it's been in a road traffic accident where it's had a crash and it's rolled onto its top of its roof and it's been crumpled a bit. Okay, but it's still drivable. Just a single driver comes in, but he notes that there's damage to the vehicle. So in that goes, and he's thinking, what the hell's it? He's then told to close the gate. He's thinking, what the hell's going on? He knew a sergeant in the control room at Bentwaters who he was very friendly with. And he went, Sergeant, he'll have called him a name. He never told me the name. He said, what's happened? And the sergeant had said to him, if you never disclose my name, I'll tell you what happened. So he said, yeah, I won't. And he didn't. And he kept that to all these years later. He didn't tell me, and I respect that. But I've no reason to think that he's lying and making it up. What's he going to gain? You know, and he could be ridiculed if he tries making up something that's a lie and then proving a lie. But he said, the sergeant said to him, when a security police officer at the east gate at RAF Woodbridge, the back gate, not the main gate, the back gate onto a rural road, country road, public British road, at RAF Woodbridge, 2 miles away, a guard, a security police officer, had seen a glowing red ball of flame drop into the forest in the distance. And she'd reported it to the Central Security Control. I've just seen this. Okay, we'll get somebody to check it out. It turned out that when they put something out over the radio, the first person to pick it up was Lieutenant Monty Tamplin, who just happened to be on the back road from Bentwaters to 2 miles away to Woodbridge. So she's on the public road near it. So she responds, yeah, okay, I'll respond to that. Which makes sense. Then, in terms of what we knew originally, then over the air, several witnesses came on and have gone on the record to say they heard shout, Bobby, Bobby, help, help, help. Right? So that we already knew had taken place. Now we can fill it in. She's on the public road, and what the sergeant told Michael Stacey Smith is this, is that as she's driving along the lonely, isolated night country road, narrow, single track, an object approximately the size of a car, a glowing ball, sphere, runs parallel with her at hedgerow height. So she's in this military vehicle, like a Jeep thing or a military vehicle, and I think you'd be a bit frightened by that. It's following you at hedgerow height on a lonely country road. She's so frightened by this that she loses control of the vehicle. Easily done. Goes into a ditch, flips the vehicle, can see this happening. The more worrying thing is that when she manages to crawl out from a vehicle, the sphere has stopped and it's looking down on her position. So what does she do in terror? Probably what I would do, what you would do. She picks up a weapon and goes bang, 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 bang. Off the object goes. The reality is that's what happened to her, and yet it was all covered up. The bullets were put back. It's very significant. Again, having been in the Air Force Police protecting nuclear weapons, their procedures would be very similar. You get allocated so many bullets in simple rounds, as we would say, for your rifle, machine gun, or whatever, and then you're expected to bring them back at the end of the shift. Well, she'd obviously discharged some bullets in very unusual circumstances, to say the least. They were all put back. It was all covered up. But I've no reason to doubt that the story given by that sergeant to Michael Stacey Smith is the real. And it makes perfect sense. And what we do know is that within a matter of days of that incident taking place, she was then shipped back to the United States, never went back on shift, never really to be seen again. Now, the interesting story in that is, I know where she lives in terms of the proximate area. I know which country she lives in. I know of several of her relatives who I've traced, sent messages to, asking her to respond, but she didn't want to. But then again, if you've had an incident like that, that's so terrifying and traumatic, maybe you don't want to ever talk about it again. But again, if you're listening, Bonnie, please, or one of your relatives is listening, you can get this message to her. Please come forward. I'd love to interview you and get your account. It's your account. It's nobody else's account. It's your testimony. But time is getting on. We're all getting older. Let's see if we can get this all on the record as soon as we can. Preserve the evidence. But I've no reason to believe that, that incident as described by that sergeant occurred. So again, unique. So basically, American US Air Force security officer run off the road by a UFO on British country road. You'd think that'd be a 6 o'clock news major headline. Don't make any headlines. Yeah, only makes podcasts interesting, but nobody's interested, and it should be, and that's the real worry. Another guy, you said major things. Well, for a long time, there'd always been this debate about whether it contained nuclear weapons. Well, I can guarantee it contained nuclear weapons because it was the same identical layout as one of the bases that I'd worked on in what was then West Germany at a place called RAF Larbrook. I worked there for 18 months, and the weapons storage area was identical in its design, almost 90% the same as what was at RAF Larbrook. A long row of bunkers that open to the ground level, and then they had underground facilities where they were moved around underneath the base. Not that I could see that, but you could see them drop down. You weren't supposed to have a look, but you occasionally did. So basically, at Bentwaters, 6 of the people I interviewed, military witnesses, said eventually, yeah, we're guarding tactical nuclear weapons. and tactical nuclear weapons is a commitment that's 365 days a year, 24/7. Your Cold War. This is high security. It's serious business, and you practice for deployment in case Soviet aggression. Blah blah blah. So it's very serious. I did that, and that's what they did. So, in terms of the events at Bentwaters, there'd been rumours on the Holt night, which is when he led a small team out into the forest, 2 nights after the incident with John and Jim, the small landed triangular craft, that they said they'd seen multiple UFOs. Well, Holt had also said beams were being shone down to the ground at or near the vicinity of the weapons storage area, approximately 2 miles away at Bentwaters. Now, Holt would say for a long time that they were just at or near because they couldn't see them because they were too geographically far away. They just appeared to be in that direction. Then he appeared in several documentaries and said that, they'd been near, but we didn't have a confirmation. We didn't have a direct witness who was inside who could confirm as a first person witness that, yeah, I saw UFO shine a beam. Well, during the course of my research, I came up with one, and he was Airman Steve Longero, who had only arrived at the base in early December. And there is a bit of a story here that's interesting. It's a big part of the background story. Is when you first got to the twin bases, you had to do like a familiarization period, maybe 2-3 weeks, where you had to do various things, learn about how the bases work, blah blah blah, and then you were allocated a shift, and then you go on shift, meet your colleagues, and off you're away. Well, for a long time, a lot of the people who were there, who were already on shift, have disputed people who've said, well, no, they couldn't have got on shift that quickly. Larry Warren was one of them. But here's the interesting thing. Warren turns up a couple of days prior to Steve Longero. But there is a key twist to this as well. All right. One of the airmen that was involved in one of the incidents, what was classed as that first night with John and Jim, was a guy called Kabanzak, Ed Kabanzak. And he basically had just arrived at the base. And people never talk about him as, why is he on shift? He shouldn't be, because he should be doing his familiarization training. Nobody ever talks about that. But they always did about Larry Warren because he's a fraud. Allegedly, that was the story that the likes of Holt, Pennis, and Burroughs would point out. Well, it now turns out that Steve Longero tells the same story. And he says within days, not 2 to 3 weeks. So whatever was going on in the background, basically they were getting on shift quicker than they normally would do. So that explains that. He's put on shift and he's allocated to work inside the weapons storage area at RAF Bentwaters. And this is the one containing tactical nuclear weapons. Now, I'd done that role myself, so walked around side. When you first get there, you're often allocated a mentor, or you go on shift with a senior person who knows what they're doing and what the procedures are. So he was done that. He was put together either with a sergeant or an experienced airman, and they're just walking around, probably 2 hours out, 2 hours in, and they're learning the procedures. And the procedures were, they would probably have exercises on shift as if they're simulated being attacked. You would have to deploy to various parts of the weapon storage area for defensive, positions, so you can take aim, that kind of thing. It's well drilled. Well, he was walking around and he said, I'm walking around with this experienced person, policeman, and he says, then we see UFO over the trees by the edge of the weapon storage area. And then it shines a beam down akin to a laser beam into the start of what was called the hot row. The hot row was this long row of bunkers that contained nuclear weapons. And that hot row is approximately 300 meters long. But he said it was doing it like it was scanning it. And he said it was doing this. Zoom. I'm just making the noise to give, as if this sweeping arc, to give it some perspective. But he said it moved completely in an arc all the way down.
Like
working its way back,
methodical.
as if, or
Yeah.
methodical, like a scan. He
Yeah.
describes it in the documentary. He says it was like it was scanning for what's inside these bunkers, which is another reason is to say, well, why do the UFOs turn up? Because they're interested in nuclear weapons. This is a confirmation that they knew that there was something in there. Now, he said it goes all the way down, beam goes off, and then he says it shoots off low over the base and then out towards Rendlesham Forest, where it's being tracked by other people who are watching it. It's going towards Rendlesham Forest. And there's it's not calm. There'll be panic, heightened state.
Yeah.
So
Like,
weird
what the
going
hell
on.
is that thing? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then he said something happens which ordinarily would never happen. But these are exceptional circumstances. His story doesn't stop there. And I had no idea what he was going to say. It's his testimony. It's not mine. I can't frame it. He's just going. I'm just asking him to tell me blow by blow. And he said, then there's a call for any airman to go out to the forest. We want people out in the forest. Well, we know lots of people have said that in an area that was called the staging area, which is basically an area into the forest, at which point there was a dead end because the trees, there was no road, there was no path. So it became what's called the staging area. The vehicles couldn't go any further into the forest, and people were all milling around thinking, what the hell's going on? All right. So we already knew that from multiple sources. But he said, I was told to come out of the weapon storage area because, in a sense, he was supernumerary. He was like a spare. He was doubled up. He was a spare. So they needed manpower for one
As he was training. Right? Yeah.
And so they pull him off. And he said, along with another 10 to 15 other security police, put in trucks out to the forest by Woodbridge, by what's called the Eastgate. So it goes into the forest, stops by the staging area, couldn't go any further. There's literally 30, 40 people milling around. He then says that he is then briefed by Colonel Holt. That's interesting. Well, he remembers that. And he said, I met him because, he's briefed us when I first got there. So that makes sense. He says, and we got briefed and we put into small groups. And he says, I was taken out into the forest by, he says, Jim Penniston, Sergeant Jim Penniston, from the first night landing. Well, that's odd in itself. Right. Because Jim Penniston was supposedly given a 6-day leave pass after his traumatic involvement. So, but he's very specific. He says it's Jim Penniston. Okay, it's his perception. That's what he recalls. So that's what we go with. So he said that Penniston takes them to the first night landing where the depressions were found in the ground where the triangle had been.
Where he and John Burroughs had.
He and John Burroughs, right?
Yeah.
But he said something then that totally blew my mind. He said, and while we're out there, we see multiple UFOs as well, flying around in the sky. So this is an entirely new incident. And this is really before Holt goes out with his team. Holt's by the staging area, but he ain't gone out yet. So this is not part of Holt's night. Holt's night takes 4.5 hours. And there's an audio record of him making intermittent recordings. 2:55, we're crossing the stream. This kind of thing. 3:55, we're seeing lights coming down to my feet, kind of thing. So that's the kind of intermittent things he was putting on a little dictaphone. But this is before he's gone out. So this is an entirely new event that people aren't aware of. You see what I mean? This is part of this 17 incidents that I've broken it down that were different timed events. And what I mean by different timed events is, imagine you're chasing somebody that's in England, we say burglary. If somebody breaks into your apartment and is carrying your television out the window or your some item of jewelry and he's running away, the police will give chase. And whilst you're in perfect vision and you can see the line of sight, that's an incident ongoing. But if then he goes around the corner and then you lose him for 35 minutes and you're looking, when you eventually see him 35 minutes later, that's a different timed event because it comes live again. So that's what I mean by live events. Yeah. Different timed events with specific gaps between them.
Yeah.
And nobody had ever broken it down like I had done. And nobody had talked to the witnesses in the detail like I had done. So when you broke it down, they would then tell me about cases that I didn't know about. Going back to Sergeant Adrian Bastinda, this is an entirely new event that's listed in the book. Nobody had ever heard of it. I'm talking to him for 4.5 hours, and one of the first things he's talking about is that he'd made lots of stops in the forest, the Rendlesham Forest, because on that night, what we termed the halt night, where he's leading this team out, he said I was what was called the NCOIC. He was the non-commissioned officer in charge of, he was a gopher. Go for this, go for that. Go get me some portable generators, some light halls, as they were called, so we can light up the forest. There's something going on. Go to Woodbridge and get me 4 light halls. Okay, comes back, gathers them. Go to Bentwater to get me 3 more. He was the gopher. So he had basically a roving commission. And we didn't realise this in its context. But he said that he was going out, coming back to the forest, the staging area, couldn't go any further. Right, there's a couple of light holes for you. Right, thanks very much. Now go get this. So it makes sense that when he keeps coming back to the forest, he has the opportunity to get involved in other stuff prior to Holt ever going out. And this is another incident there. He said, I was at the staging area, and he said, a senior officer came over to me, one Holt, and he said, I want you to form like a skirmish line. And what you mean by that is, you remember, if you've ever seen police doing a fingertip search of a field, looking for a knife or any kind of evidence, there's like a line of 20 people all next to each other, on their knees, going forward, looking through the undergrowth, trying to recover evidence. Well, he was told to form effectively a line search. But this line search was like 20 people, 20 US Air Force security police, that were maybe 10 meters apart in the forest. So you're then already looking at 200 meters, and do a line search forward into the forest. And this is all before the halt night. And I'm thinking, well, I've never heard of this, but yeah, carry on. Yeah. So this is all new information. But why is he going to make it up? And he was in the zone. He was reliving this like he'd never done. It was like he was exercising a ghost. He wanted to finally tell the story.
So one thing I wanted to ask you,
Go
go
on.
ahead. I was just going to
Well,
say, like throughout your career, you've interviewed a lot of people in a lot of different situations, and so you've obviously developed some kind of, honesty
instinct for
radar.
the truth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
whether people are telling the truth. And when you
Yeah.
interview these folks, they obviously meet your standard of being
Oh, absolutely.
completely, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. You can tell within seconds. I can tell within seconds as an advanced interviewer. And a lot of that is because of non-verbal communication, NVCs. You give off things when you're telling the truth. You do things that you're not aware that you're doing. But like when you're reliving an incident, and when you're wanting to try to get them to concentrate, you say to them, okay, I want you to either look at the wall, whatever you feel comfortable, look down at the ground, close your eyes, do whatever you're comfortable with, but I want you to really concentrate on trying to recall detail. It's not hypnosis, because you can't do it from 2,000 miles away on a transatlantic call. But what you're trying to do is set up people in the right way so they know that they're in charge of their own interview. I'm not leading it, but I'm just setting up kind of how we do it. And then you're asking them to concentrate. And that's what he was doing. And then you have what's called, the way the British do it in advanced interviewing, is you have what's called a first recall. Okay? So when you first say to somebody, I want you to just do it however you want, start wherever you want, not necessarily at the beginning. Because don't forget, a witness may be traumatized, and like somebody who's been raped, the victim may say, I hated his breath. And that's the start point of your interview. You can't say, oh, no, hang on a minute. How did you get in the room? Because then that basically screws up their memory.
Yeah.
It has to be what's relevant to them. So you set it up that way and say, you start wherever you want to start, whatever is pertinent to you. And we can always come back to it and clarify. But in that first account, and this is something that's hard for a lot of people, and hard for police officers across the board to get their head around, is you don't interrupt. So you set it up in the right way, and then you say, okay, when you're ready, start telling me. And you'd said to them, I'm not going to interrupt you. Until you stop, I'm not going to interrupt you. Now, I've done interviews where people have spoken for 2 hours. I have not interrupted. Now, what do police officers do? You never see Kojak doing this, do you? Just waiting 2 hours. Where was it? What pub? What, you know? And that's what most police officers still do. But in advanced interviewing, you do this first account. And that's how I was trying to set them up. And they're in the zone, they concentrate. And when somebody's really in the zone, you can tell they're in the zone within seconds. And they're back there. They're back there. They're reliving it, or as best, well, not best, the closest they'll come to reliving it. And they're there and they're concentrating and they're in the zone and they're talking and stuff is coming out. Now, basically what you get in that first account is you don't interrupt. And what you do is, I'm giving you interview tips here, but basically what you do is you basically let them go. And when they're going on, you go, okay, okay, all right. Whenever they're giving something, okay, you kind of, every time it's called googling. You're encouraging them through minimal usage of your language for them to keep in that zone. The last thing you want to do is break that concentration. So when they're in the zone, you don't want to screw that up, because it's what's called retrieving fresh snow. Yeah? Remember when it snows, everything is pristine, beautiful. Even the most cold slag looks beautiful when it's covered in snow. And then what do? We wake up, we tread all over it, and it looks a mess. When you're retrieving fresh snow, it means you're retrieving memories that were in your mind but being locked away. But you've managed to, through concentration, to get back on track. And you can see them processing. And it's not like they're going, wow, they're just in the zone. So they don't really realize what they're saying to an extent, but they're in the zone and they're recalling it in a clear way that they've never done, perhaps ever. All right. Yeah. But you know when they're doing it. And it's really good to see. And so when somebody does that, and it's really important, it's burned into their memory. And the brain is a bit like a video camera. It's recording things on so many levels that you're not aware of. But through memory tools, you can possibly access these still hidden parts of the mind. And so this is what you get taught in advanced interviewing, these memory tools. And so basically, in that first account, you don't interrupt, and you just want them to keep going, because they're just looking at fresh snow and they're revealing information, and it's pristine as far as their memory is. Yeah. And so you let them run, and basically when they come to a natural pause, whether it's a minute, 5 minutes, 2 hours down the line, and there's a natural pause, you then say, thank you for your account. Thank you for concentrating. I just want to clarify a few points now. And that's when you start breaking it down, because then you start putting it into a chronological order and go into areas that kind of make sense and piece it all together. And that's when you do your clarification. You said there was a car. What color was the car? Do you recall? Oh, it was a red. It was a red Mustang. Yeah. That's when you fill in that detail. But they might have just said there was a car. And these are things that you've got to remember. It's very hard mentally to do that and then concentrate. You might write the odd thing down just as a key word to go back to. I want to go back to that. Yeah. There were 4 people in the bar. 4 people in the bar, right? Describe the 4 people in the bar. So in that clarification stage, that's when you go back. So these are the kind of things that I was doing, and I'd set them up. And with Steve Longero and in particular, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, that's the technique I used. Now, the amazing thing is that technique is supposed to be used within 24 hours to 72 hours of a major incident of murder, manslaughter, right? Yeah, and here we are 40 odd years later. It's not designed for that, let alone 2,000 miles away in a phone call. But I've always believed that the elements of it, when you are involved, if say you had a major traffic accident and your brother had been killed in the same car accident, you're never going to forget that unless you were completely knocked out. If you were conscious, it's seared into your brain.
Yeah.
and you know that. And so anything like a major UFO event, a plane crash, or something, it can be anything. You find going in and finding your father's passed away in 2 minutes you were earlier. You're going to remember that for the rest of your life because it's ingrained into your memory. And things like this kind of case and events are so unusual that they're ingrained into your memory. And all it is can you access that memory? Because it's in there somewhere. If you're set up in the right way, you might be able to access some of it. And he did. And another thing with Sergeant Adrian Bustinza that he has in the book, he has 110 pages of a 500-page book.
Yeah.
Now that shows how important he is because he, you know, and I'm just glossing over it. But one of the other things that was really interesting was his treatment afterwards. Several of the people involved in these incidents were interviewed under duress, given a hard time, interrogated, not just asked for their account, they were given a hard time. Ed Cabanza was told repeatedly, you didn't see anything in the forest. Well, I did. I saw. Oh, you didn't. You saw a lighthouse. No, I didn't. You saw a lighthouse. People were threatened with their lives. Bullets are cheap. Your family. Your dad works for the government. Ah, well, we'll see about that. Threats to the family. Job, security, money. That's how it works. And we can see that in the world. Sadly, we see this in the world all the time. Threats and whatever, power. And he said that he was taken to an underground facility under the base photo lab, which was at, I think, Woodbridge. And he said he went into an underground facility, which Holt says doesn't exist. But Larry Warren said he was taken also down to an underground facility and put in a room and given a hard time.
Both those guys, their stories were both.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah.
All right. And so I'm inclined to go with Pennison, with Sergeant Adrian Bustinza and Larry Warren, right? Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, by the way, his background, he had over 40 years in law enforcement and the correctional facilities working with offenders. So this guy is as good a guy as you're ever going to get. He's dedicated his life to trying to help people and serve his country and whatever. And so he is top-notch guy. I wouldn't doubt him for a minute. I doubt a lot of people in the Rendlesham story, but I wouldn't doubt him. He's absolutely first-class guy. Steve Longero, over 30 years of military and police sheriff background. Absolutely stand-up character. Absolutely. You can just tell it easy for somebody like me. You can tell these people are absolutely spot on, dedicated, genuine people. So Adrian Bustinza said he was taken down and he was put into this like cold, dark, underground room with big hurly-burly guards, not in uniform, in civilian clothing suits, and basically hand on each shoulder, you sit there, military. Could be, I nearly said something political there. I said it could be an ice snatch squad. Think of it there. Think of it as an ice snatch squad. That's the scenario. Scary. And he's thinking, I'm a good guy here. I'm a sergeant in the Air Force.
Yeah.
I ain't done anything wrong. And he's been given the hard word. Bullets are cheap. You know, being given a hard time. And he said that after the incident, when he got out of the interrogation, he said, I was so disgusted by what had happened to him and the threats and the way he'd been treated as a sergeant doing his job for his country that he said, I wanted to run away. I wanted to go AWOL, absent without leave. I wanted to desert. And the effects of that caused the post-trauma along with the incidents that he was involved in. And when you read in the book that passage, because I had to transcribe 4.5 hours of material, you're looking at 70, 80 pages of written material, handwritten first, because you have to listen to it again, make sure you got the right words. And you still might get the odd word that you can't make out, but literally it took forever. But when you read it back, and one of the things that I did when I was proofing the book is I read it back like I'm an actor to see how it comes across. And it's only when you really do that, and at the time when I'm living it, you don't realize how good it is or how emotional it is, because I'm concentrating on the next questions and what he's saying and making a mental note of this. And this is the juggling act that you do as an investigator. A really good interviewer is not really writing things down, but they're going in, you're processing all this information. You think, I must come back to that. And yeah, right, okay. Now, he when I read it back, that particular section where he's on about his interrogation, it's visceral. It has a visceral quality. You feel the guy. You feel as if you're being interrogated. It's that real in the way he's speaking. And at one point, he's almost in tears telling me this. That's when you know that it's real, because you can't really fake that kind of emotion. And he's locked in this zone. He's not even looking at me. It's a transatlantic phone call, but he's gone. I've asked him to concentrate. He's got there. And through a process of questioning techniques, he's in the zone and he's telling it for the first time. It's like he's exercising a ghost, and it's painful, but it is so raw. And nobody makes documentaries about the people who were interviewed, who were given a hard time. Multiple interviews and interrogations by unknown groups, probably the Office of Special Investigation, but they deny making any interviews. They deny making any audio recordings, which would have probably been standard, like it was for the military police that I was at, Royal Air Force Police. We recorded an audio at that time. So there's so much that's lied. There are far more documents. Another thing that came out that doesn't seem really that important, but in the context of everything it is I found out from 3 military sources, 3 military witnesses, that routinely all of the police radio channels, of which there were 4, were audio recorded. Wow. Think of all that evidence tape that was there once, that it existed in physical form. Again, remember what I said? That's the audio tape. You hold it because this is the night of this, and it's the the security police now. Now, Adrian Bustinza confirmed that in an indirect way during that 4.5 hours. And he said that several years later, he received a package out of the blue for unknown package, unknown sender, and it had 3 audio tapes. And it was from 3 of the 4 radio channels on one of the particular nights. So at that one time, he had that. Now, the sad fact is that he kept, for many years afterwards, he kept a lot of stuff. And he put it in a little briefcase because he wanted to have some memory of what he collected, physical evidence, written documents, various things, shift rosters and things like that with names and things like that. But over a period of time, it led to such difficulties with his parents, and his father's work was suffering. His brother was in the military police as well, and he was given a hard time. Not as like him, but he'd been given a hard time. His father's work, he was being surveilled. Their parents' home was being surveilled all the time. So at one point, many years later, in the late 80s, I think he said it was, he said he got so fed up and his mum had given him such a hard time that he took out the briefcase and he set fire to it. Like, I've had enough. And his mum was encouraging him. And he was trying to exercise the ghost. But again, we lost some valuable evidence there. But he said he got 3 audio tapes proving, again, another corroborative statement, independent of others that had told us that there were reel-to-reel audio tapes that were being changed every 24 hours. So that evidence did exist. Now, can you imagine if we had access to those tapes? We wouldn't have no dispute, would we?
No.
But they won't exist now. Yeah. So I have no doubt that that video and cinefilm exists, or did exist. Probably doesn't exist now, or if it does, it's in the Raiders of the Lost Ark hangar.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which you'll never see. But here's a little thing: a researcher called Ray Boucher, who was a MUFON researcher,
Yeah. I mean,
Did great work with his colleague Scott Colburn for about 3 years between 84 and 86 into Rendlesham. And they did brilliant work, arguably the best research ever done. Never really given the credit until I'm giving them the credit in the book. They did fantastic. They spoke to Holt first. They spoke to various military witnesses for the first time in 1984. They really did a good job. One of the things that Ray Boucher would say was that over a period of time, he got so proficient at putting freedom of information requests to the Pentagon, they almost got to know the lady in the Pentagon office, FOI office, and they became like on first name basis, in polite terms, not friends, but they became polite on a first name. And at one point, they were talking, and he said, "An interesting thing happened today." And she says, "What's that?" He says, "Well," and this is her perspective, a lady called Ann Turner. He said, she said, "I heard a group of American pilots, military pilots, talking about the Rendlesham video, or the Rendlesham film." And she said, "I looked on our records, we ain't got any film." So it makes you wonder.
yeah.
So, so I suspect that film, that second landing, really did occur. I have no reason to believe that Sergeant Adrian Bustinza made that up just to protect Larry Warren. That's ridiculous. Why would you do that? He's a very credible guy.
So all of these things lead me to the question. I mean, so you have Charles Halt and John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, and Nick Pope telling one story or a version of the story, and it seems like that they are trying to exclude certain aspects of the story that you've been able to unearth through the research of your book. What is your sense of motive? Do you have one? Are you willing to? I mean, what's?
Well, this is where you go into speculation. I can't prove it.
Yes.
I can prove that the narrative is being controlled because of the fact that they don't ask the questions that I've asked. If you're supposed to be investigating these incidents like Jim Penniston did for his book, then he should have asked these questions of the same people. He should have gone out of his way to re-interview these people. They didn't. Nick Pope wrote a book called Encounters in Rendlesham Forest. It was one of the poorest books ever written. It was just a rehash. And it was supposed to be John and Jim's book. Now, for many years, that's the rumor, or they're writing a book with Nick Pope, but it's basically John and Jim's story. Okay, fair enough. Well, it turns out that the book was like 24 chapters, only 3 or 4 related to John and Jim. The rest of it was just a standard rehash of everything that was known. No hard questions, nothing that asked any difficult questions.
No re-examination.
And so you see what I mean? In terms of investigation, but here's the thing. There's a chapter on Nick Pope in the book. And I knew Nick Pope, and we were very friendly at one point, very polite with each other. But as soon as I started writing this book and researching for the book, he then said I should be arrested. Because basically, I'm involved in a fraudulent film. Larry Warren's a liar, a con man, blah, blah, blah. This is Nick Pope. And he said, I am involved in a scam. No evidence for it. And so there were lots of incidents, but I just concentrated on the facts. But I put one of his social media quotes out where he said that. But why would you be frightened of somebody trying to do the job? And really what that was all about is that they didn't want to talk about a second landing. They didn't want to talk about aliens, the possibility of entities being there. And where did that come from? Holt. As soon as he retired in 1991, Larry Warren, he's a wannabe. He wasn't there. He was kicked out of the Air Force. No, the guy's a loser. Now, why would you do that? Never backed it up with any evidence whatsoever.
And it seems like
Holt. I worked with Holt for 7 years on a collaboration for a film script between 2007 and 2014. So I kind of got to know him well. Only met him twice, but we had this 7-year online collaboration and we regularly chatted. And he always had this down on Warren and said, look, that's his account. Why is you as a senior officer, the most senior officer, really to go on the record? You should be gathering all the witnesses and saying, look, all come forward. Everybody's got a different perspective, but let's work together to try to get commonality. But not so. As soon as he retired, on the offensive. As soon as Jim Penniston retired, on the offensive against Warren. As soon as John Boros retired, on the offensive. Oh, I don't recall any of that. It doesn't match my memories. And but Holt in particular was a real downer. And yet Sergeant Adrian Bustinza finally, in I think 2019, when in that transatlantic phone call, says 90% corroborates everything that it said. A second landing, security police, cordon, craft, entities, silhouettes, cameras, police officers. I'll go with that, because that's the second corroboration. Holt never gives you any corroboration. And here's an example. When I first met Holt was in December 2007. Nobody ever talks about hard questions for Holt because he's a colonel. Colonels can't lie. Alas, I don't agree with that. Anybody can lie. Right? So basically, I met him for a UFO Hunters series, and they were coming over to the UK to film me and talk about police cases. So they'd been interviewing me, and then I said, "Well, what else are you doing when you're coming over? You're not just coming to see me." Flattering all that would be. And they went, "No, we're going to do Rendlesham." And I said, "Oh, I'm interested in Rendlesham." They said, "Why?" And they explained my background. And I said, "I think Holt knows a lot more." "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you can come down to the shoot." So that's how I first got involved. So you create your own journey, as it were. And that's how I first met Holt, December 2007, for this documentary, UFO Hunters. And anyway, one of the things that I said I'd like to do is go up to the top of the weapons storage area tower, which is then the base was closed in terms of the weapons storage area. It's then like a business park, but things are still there. But you could get permission from the people who own the business park, which is the base, to do various bits of filming. And nobody had ever gone up to the top of the high tower in the weapons storage area. And the high tower is twice the height of all the trees nearby, as was that when it was real. I.e., tower at 80 feet, trees were kept to a maximum of 40 feet. So it had a perfect 360, quickly see anything attacking. Yeah. And so we're up there, and I took my video camera with me, and they'd let me, with Holt, go up to the top, and they were then going to come up and do some filming with us at the top. But they were talking about setups and whatever. So we went up there ahead of the film crew. So we're at the top. And he'd already told me in an email that a guy in the weapons storage area tower called Rick had contacted him and said that, and this is a virtual quote, that in no uncertain terms, the guy in the tower saw a UFO shine a beam down into the weapons storage area, and the security police officers on the ground inside the weapons storage area saw them too. So he'd already told me that. So I took my camera up there. I said, "Look, will you tell me that again?" So I've got a clip of it, not knowing the ramifications. And he went, "Yeah, okay." And he said exactly the same for me. And that video clip I put on UFO Truth magazine YouTube site, and it's been out there for years. And he says exactly that a guy called Rick told him in no uncertain terms. When his book comes out in 2016, The Whole Perspective, he denies that he ever told me that. It's on video. It's pretty unanimous. It's your voice, it's you. And yet he was saying, no, nothing specific. And I'm thinking, that's a lie. It's a provable lie, as it's called. Because there's the testimony. And this is not AI back in 2000.
Yeah, this is not a
deep fake. You see what I mean? So is he capable of lying? Yes, everybody's capable of lying at times. Father Christmas, we're all capable of telling lies at times. It's just context. I talked to loads of people during the course of my police career, and they're living next to a drug dealer, and they're frightened stiff of the drug dealer next door. And yet they really want to give you a police statement, but they know if they do, they'll get either their house kicked in, beaten up, kids beaten up, set fire to the car, to the house. Under those circumstances, people go, I can't give you a statement. Well, I do know stuff, but I can't tell you. Totally understandable. And it's a similar kind of thing. people are forced to lie, sometimes for genuine reasons. Yeah. So it's all about context. And that's the devil is in the detail and the context.
Wonder, how would you say you've been treated by sort of ufology brought? I mean, your story counters some people who are pretty anchored in this community and have been telling these stories for a long time. Has there been any animosity from the establishment because of what you've revealed,
Well,
or have people been pretty open-minded?
no, I since the book has come out, all the researchers who read it said it's in their words, the definitive work on the case because of it, the way I've done it. But the interesting thing is, and this is where I'm not interested in money, because if I was, I'd have gone to a mainstream publisher because it's an important book and I had lots of new evidence. So I think I would have found a mainstream publisher. But because of the way the narrative is being controlled, I chose to self-publish. And with it, you'd no chance of ever getting big sales through self-publishing. You just don't have the same publicity machine. All right. You think of Imminent. You think of Hide in Plain Sight, Rose Coulthart, these multiple bestsellers. And they've gone through mainstream and they've had worldwide publicity to push the book. I chose to put the book to self-publish because I knew, or I suspected, that if I said on December the 1st, my first book is coming out, it's called this, I suspected that people, even though they would have no evidence to stop me, they would try to use legal injunctions to prevent me from getting the evidence out that I'd accumulated. So I deliberately chose truth over money because I wanted to get the story out. And I figured that if just 50 people, it's a lot more than 50, but I figured if just 50 people got to see what was in the book, it's more than they've ever been exposed to before. But since the book's come out, I've done countless podcasts, newspaper, TV, and whatever. And nobody questions what I've done because it's all backed up by the facts. I give all the sources for all the references that I've used, and the facts speak for themselves. You'd said this in an interview in magazine in 1985. You said this. There it is. There's the reference. Go look it up yourself. And so that's what I did. So nobody had ever really done what I'd done. Nobody really had the background to approach it in the way that I did. And I'm extremely flattered by all the comments. Don Smith wrote the foreword. He's the top guy on Roswell. And he wrote an absolute, when I read it, I was almost in tears. It was that glowing. I was so humbled by it. But, for me, it's about getting the truth out. And I'm glad I self-published. What I would like to do now, though, and nobody's ever come back in the 2.5 years since, not one comment has come back.
To say that, yeah.
Yeah, I dispute
from a
that.
source saying I didn't say that or whatever. Yeah.
So it proves that I was right. I stand by what's in the book. Absolutely. Yeah. But the thing is, down the line is I've got more material now. Another military witness that
was going to be my final question, actually, is where has this story evolved? I mean, where's it?
Well, the story is now that I would like to find a mainstream publisher because I'm ready to write a second edition because there are some changes. There was one a brand new case that was listed in the book called the James Stewart story. So if anybody's read it, it's got this chapter. I think it's chapter 25. It was an entirely new military witness, and he wasn't a security police. He was a aircraft technician. He fixed aircraft, and he had an incredible event, which he had originally told me was late December 1980. So you'd think, well, it's in that cluster. But it turns out that a week after the book had come out and been self-published, he said, I'm sorry to have to tell you. He said, I've been checking my military records. I left Beckmorton Woodbridge in, I think, February 1980. Oh, so it couldn't have been December 1980. So it was December 1979. So he was sticking by everything he'd said. And I'd interviewed him in this format and video and whatever. Got a statement from him through this process of interviewing him on video. And he was, again, stand-up guy called James Stewart, not the actor. Really lovely guy, genuine guy. And he'd made a mistake. And as soon as he'd realised, he'd told me. But, of course, that then edition is still out there. So I want to make changes. And there's new information. I recently got a Rendlesham witness come forward. Again, not security police, but it tells a very interesting story that has background information that, for the first time, gives us evidence of another area that's not talked about much, which is a drugs bust. That then meant that the security police had been involved. Some of the security police had been locked up for being out in Amsterdam and bringing drugs back to the base. So there was a manpower shortfall, hence why they didn't do the training for as long as, because they would have to put people on shift quick because it's 365, 24/7. So that context comes forward.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
finally get a witness filling in that little piece of a jigsaw. And that's what investigations are, the pieces of a jigsaw. And that little piece just falls into place. And so that's an important story. There's the testimony that's come back from people like Adrian Bustinza reading the book and reading about their account and getting the feedback from them. I don't know what you're going to say. Hopefully I've done a good job, but it's in the end, they say what they're going to say. And, so it's all that kind of stuff. So there's probably another 100 pages that I could add to it. With new material, and I could expand on certain things. When I had more material, I'd done other interviews, but in the end, you're thinking, kind of, I swear now, but you go, shit, I'm already at 500 pages. In the first format, depending on the size of the text, it was like 800 pages. I'm thinking, you've got to make it smaller writing, and then because you're self-publishing, you can practice before you actually go live. And I got it down to 500 pages. That's good, But there's a lot more. But when people read the book, God, Christ, it's so detailed. It's tiny writing, but it would have been 800 pages. So I think there's a lot more to do now, and I think that when you self-publish, you might reach a few thousand. When you go through a publishing house, you reach hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
If it's a bestseller.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of people, and even in the United States, where this case is a really famous case because it's involving predominantly American servicemen, time and time again, I'm interviewed by podcasters who think they know the case, but they don't have a clue, because all they've been able to view is the narrative that's been controlled and
the History Channel documentaries.
Yeah, that's right. And so, but that's a controlled narrative, and it's about time that it reached a wider audience. So yeah, if there's any mainstream publishers or people out there, I'd love to find one. I've not approached any yet, but I'm at the point where I think I have enough material now to do a second edition and try to reach many thousands of people around the world. At the moment, it's a few thousand. That's not the same. The world needs to know about all the changes, because the Americans in particular who think they know the case don't.
Mm-hmm.
And, famous people, Ross Coulthard, I did reality check with him, and he thought he knew the case, but he didn't. So, so I'm pointing things out, and then they're amazed by all this new knowledge. And, this is why I come back to podcasters. You do a great job. You've given me an opportunity to try to, reach out
to the record straight.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the end, all you're trying to do is tell the truth. And that's what it's all about, is trying to find evidence and try to put it out. And I'm kind of proud of what I did by self-publishing and putting the truth out before money, because most people, it's the opposite way around. But yeah, it deserves to reach a wider audience, and I hope in time that it will.
So last question, let's call this. Your book's called Non-Human.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that there is and I'll put a link to people to buy it in the description so people can go pick it up.
I'll send you a link if you put it out on the podcast link.
That sounds great.
I'll do that. But yeah.
Real quick, I had a question I wanted to ask. What do you think was going on? I mean, obviously non-human visits, but it sounds like, according to the testimony that you've gotten, that there was some sort of meetup with base leadership. They were scanning nuclear missiles. Was there any sense that you've gotten of what the overall purpose or impact of the Rendlesham Forest incident was that maybe has gone sort of unnoticed by most until now, that some sort of coherent accomplishment that was sought? Or is it still too much of a...
No, I think there are some conclusions you can broadly derive. We know historically that UFOs have been interested in nuclear weapons, nuclear storage facility, power plants, right back to the 1940s. So UFOs turn up regularly at Bentwaters. Now, if you ask Holt, he will neither confirm or deny, because he's a senior officer, that there were nuclear weapons there. In the book, I find a document that says there was nuclear weapons there. 25 nuclear weapons were listed at Bentwaters. But here's the thing, it's all about context. So why do they turn up in late December 1980? Why in particular is there a cluster of events that appear to be interested in nuclear weapons? And I think it's this, that most people don't realize the historical context of what was happening around the world in 1980, in late December. In late December 1980, we were at a really very dangerous place, close to World War III. And that was because there were two major incidents going on. In Poland, Lech Wałęsa, who then went on to become the president, was then the leader of the shipyard workers in a city called Gdansk. And they were thinking, we want to break away from the Soviet Union, of which they were a part. So Poland was part of the Soviet Union. And they were throughout saying, no, we want our independence. We want to be our own sovereign country, Poland. And so they were getting really popular. So historically in the past, this is for your history, two other European countries had tried to go along the same route. They wanted revolution. They wanted to break away. Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And each time the Soviet Union rolled in with the tanks and quelled the uprising, staying as under the Soviet Union. Now, this was likely to happen again, and everybody thought it would. So, late December 1980, what was happening? The Polish shipyard workers were trying to get independence, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the Polish border in late December 1980, as if they were going to go in and quell the uprising. So that was one world significant event that were raising tensions. And the other one was 52 American hostages held in Iran, Iraq, Iranian, I think it was, Iran. And Iran, yeah, and so that was a powder keg of the Middle East. So here's the thing. Bentwaters was listed in this document as able to house tactical nuclear weapons. Document proves it, regardless of what Holt will say. Neither confirm or deny. But what Holt had said to me on two occasions is the key, I think, to this. The first night I met him, in December 2007, for the UFO Hunters program, we weren't required for filming. We both arrived there at the hotel at more or less the same time. I knew him. He didn't know me. I introduced myself to him. And he welcomed me. We had a great chat. We weren't required for any night filming. So we sat in the pub that was a part of the hotel and had an evening meal. And I was like, wow, wow. I'm chatting with Holt, I was like that. And he told me that night, and maybe because I was the ex-military, maybe because I was detective, I was a serving detective at the time, he said to me there were more nuclear weapons than anywhere else at Bentwaters, more nuclear weapons than anywhere else in Europe. That's what he told me. So a lot more than the 25, I suspect, were hidden underground, all right, against the armament treaties. So they might say you can have 25. Officially, there's only 25, but there might be 525. So there's maybe an unofficial, huge arsenal of undeclared nuclear weapons there. Now, that might get UFOs interested if it's their planet as well. If they live in underwater bases around the world, that's their habitat too that could be destroyed in a mutual assured destruction nuclear war. Okay. In 2010, I met him again for another documentary, a private documentary that never aired, still never aired. But we did the film. And I had my then second wife with me, and I said, we've got a bit of spare time. You've got your audio tape. I've got a copy of it. Why don't will you walk through the forest with me? We'll replay your tape and we'll see if it jogs any memories. He went, yeah, okay. and my wife tagged along, but it was me and Holt just walking through the forest, retracing the steps of his famous audio tape. And it did reveal new material, new information. And he knew that my wife was on her iPhone, and she's no great camera woman. He's just taking various little clips here and there, photographs. I even had my dog with me, my big Alsatian, German Shepherd. And he's roaming around the forest with us. So you see him in photographs. But we're walking around, perhaps for 2.5 hours, retraced his steps. That was an invaluable insight. We gathered new material. But in front of my wife, but unfortunately not recorded, because she was only doing intermittent clips, he said in front of my wife, there were more nuclear weapons than anywhere else in Europe. The first time he'd said more nuclear weapons than anywhere else in Britain, I think it was. But this was anywhere else in Europe. So it'd gone from just Britain to Europe. I think I got that wrong. So it's Britain the first time he tells me, and it's Europe the second time. So wow, it's this secret underground huge number of nuclear weapons in case of a Soviet. Now you think about that in the Soviet aggression. You think of the Polish shipyard workers, the massing on the Polish borders. If World War III had started there, we could well have been on the road to a nuclear war. So maybe I think this was a nuclear inspection. What have you got in there? This is a lot more than the 25. And who knows why they didn't invade? I don't know, because Poland did get its independence. 1981, not long afterwards, they do get independence. The Soviet Union collapses. I think what was 91. So you kind of think, but for me, it's the nuclear weapons connection, and I do believe that UFOs are have bases in our deepest oceans. It makes sense. We only know 10% of the ocean. 10%. Here we are with all this technology. We've only mapped 10% of the ocean. That we know more about the surface of the moon and Mars than we do about our own Earth. That's crazy. 10% even now. So in the deepest trenches, and UFOs have been seen for 60, 70 years going in and out of large bodies of water all around the world. So it makes sense. So if it's their bases, it's their habitat. If we go to nuclear Armageddon and we're all killed and radiation everywhere, the oceans are ruined, their habitats are ruined. Maybe we've destroyed the planet completely. But in the main, in doing so, we've destroyed their bases too. So I do think there's a strong correlation between what happened at Rendlesham with nuclear weapons. That's my determination. But you can't prove it.
Yeah.
Can't prove it.
Well, that's all the time I have. Thank you for a fantastic conversation.